You all had an article to read called Taming the Wild, and you also watched an evolution of the dog video. The reason I'm having you guys read this article and watch this video is because they both focus on a particular case study in evolution through natural or through artificial selection. So I wanted to talk a little bit about artificial selection and how it can sort of soup up and really speed up the evolution of behavior. Now, we said it can be really hard to study evolution because it's such a slow process, and our lives are relatively short compared to the time it takes for evolution to occur in action. However, the last way we said you could study evolution in the last little mini recorded lecture was through studying artificial selection. So we're going to be talking quite a bit about artificial selection in class as we discuss the article and the video you guys watched. But I wanted to add some extra information to that as well. I think it kind of makes sense when you think about why artificial selection is a much faster evolutionary process. Remember, we said that that natural selection can occur even with a relatively small fitness advantage. We talked about the African wild dogs and how if hunting in a group had even a 1% fitness benefit, you would still see that all dogs in this population would eventually cooperatively hunt, right? We said a little over 1,000 generations, we'd still get it, even with a very small fitness benefit. Well, the thing is, with artificial selection, we are doing the choosing of who mates, who doesn't, and how often. So we can create artificially a much bigger fitness benefit or fitness cost to certain conditions. And I want to talk about a couple of examples of that. We're going to start with chickens. Before we talk about exactly what kinds of things we can see through artificial selection in chickens, I just wanted you to think about this for a moment. The closest living relative of our domesticated chicken's ancestor is the jungle fowl. We're actually pretty sure the jungle fowl is really very, very similar to the ancestor of the chicken. When you think about egg laying in jungle fowl, it's not so different from egg laying in other birds, wild birds that you guys are probably familiar with. Jungle fowl live in very warm climates, so they can, instead of just having one nest or clutch of eggs a year, they can get two in the year because the temperature is good enough for that. The food is available. So jungle fowl will have two clutches of eggs. This is the term for the eggs that you would lay at one time in a nest, right? Like the robins and the birds around here do, cardinals, stuff like that. So they'll have two clutches of eggs a year. And a clutch for them is typically 4 to 6 eggs per clutch. And they'll lay those 4 to 6 eggs kind of together about the same time. Then they'll sit on those eggs till they hatch. They'll take care of those babies, feeding them, protecting them. Once they're ready to fledge or leave the nest, they have one more chance during the year that they could have another batch of eggs. So we're saying really maximum 12 eggs a year, and it's very, very seasonal. This is a kind of high end for how many eggs a bird lays. Not crazy high, but this idea of having just 1 or 2 batches of eggs that you raise per year and doing it in a given specific season is pretty typical. Let's compare that to one of our domesticated chicken species, the leghorn. Leghorns are known as being pretty good egg layers. So if you're looking to raise a chicken to have eggs, they're a good choice. Look at what their body is doing. It is making 300 eggs per year, not 12, 300. The leghorns lay 1 a day most days, and they will lay eggs year-round. So this is not seasonal for them anymore. And this is true even in regions of the country that get really pretty harsh winters. You would not see a wild bird in even an area like Missouri that has pretty mild winters. You're not seeing a wild bird laying any eggs in December or in January. It just wouldn't happen. Their body would not go into a position where it's laying eggs at that time. Also, you wouldn't see them have one egg they're laying every single day, right? Think about the kind of physical changes we must have made to these jungle fowl, to the ancestors of the chicken, so a bird like the jungle fowl, Think about the changes we've made to its body, its physical structure, its behavior, its parenting styles. How many changes did we make? Think about that. It is a crazy shift in how egg laying happens, when it happens, how it's timed out. Huge shift. That comes from artificial selection. We did not sit around and wait for jungle fowl to, through natural selection, become these birds that are laying one egg a day. We made that happen. Now, you guys read and watched in the video a little bit about a guy named Dmitry Belayev and the work he did with foxes in Russia. This has become an incredibly important study in understanding evolution and animal behavior. Before Belayev did his work, we assumed, as they mentioned in the video, that evolution was always incredibly slow. So we couldn't understand how we would get changes like dogs coming seemingly pretty quickly until Belayev did this study with foxes, right? Where we could see that in just a couple generations, you could get some major changes in physical structure and behavior. So it didn't have to take that long. Well, I wanted to tell you about another related study. This one's done with chickens. A researcher named Per Jensen did a study with red jungle fowl. So remember, the jungle fowl is probably the closest living relative to the domesticated chicken. Some people think it might be virtually identical to the ancestor of the domesticated chicken because they haven't been domesticated that long in the grand scheme of things. Just like Belayev with his fearful versus tame foxes, Per Jensen was breeding two different lines of chickens, fearful and what he called fearless. His fearless line is kind of like the tame line in the fox study. So the fearful chickens would either try and be aggressive or would try and flee when a human handler approached them. The fearless chickens were more calm, they were more chill, they would be less reactive to a human. So again, he bred fearful with fearful and fearless with fearless. So now he has these two different kinds of chicken lines. After 3 generations, that fearless line, the group of chickens who weren't so reactive to humans, he found that they physically grew faster. He wasn't breeding for that, he was breeding for fearlessness. They grew faster. He also found that they laid bigger eggs than those fearful birds did. He also, and this is the term that he uses in his paper on this, found that they were bossier. And anyone who's been around a domesticated chicken knows exactly what he means by bossy, right? They were a little bit pushy, not mean, just, pushy. They're pushier, which I find kind of charming. Okay, so that happened after just 3 generations of breeding fearless to fearless and fearful to fearful. After 6 generations, the fearless line, he saw some other really cool things. He saw that that fearless line had more efficient metabolisms. And what that means is they would gain more weight per kilogram of food they were fed than the fearful line did. Think about that. Let's go back and think about yourself as a farmer, right? So you're trying to, maybe chickens aren't yet domesticated. You find these birds in the wild, a couple of them, they're not so reactive to you. You can get pretty close to them. They don't really peck at you too much. You might want to breed those. That's good. I can handle these better. The fearful ones, the really aggressive ones, maybe those become dinner for you and your family, right? If you keep breeding those fearless ones together, it's not just that you're getting a more handleable chicken. You're also getting, who wouldn't want this as a farmer, a more efficient metabolism. I don't have to feed them as much to get them just as big. I mean, that's great. Food is a resource, right? Also, they're growing faster. We're going back to that 3 generations already. You see that they're getting bigger faster. Again, a good thing. More meat to eat more quickly. They're laying bigger eggs. Again, a great thing. If I want to be able to sell those eggs or I want to be able to cook or eat with those eggs, I'm getting more food out of those same chickens. The bossy part, I probably don't really care about one way or the other, but I definitely care about bigger eggs, bigger bodies, more efficient metabolisms. When we look at the mechanism, we're going back to mechanism. What's the mechanism for all these changes, right? What's going on internally? What Jensen found is that these fearless lines had higher levels of serotonin, a neurotransmitter that I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of before. This neurotransmitter, serotonin, is probably both the key to being more fearless versus fearful, and also the key to having a more efficient metabolism, right? So when you breed for fearlessness, you get higher, fearless birds just have higher levels of serotonin. Serotonin is one of those neurotransmitters that will affect a few different things. And in chickens, it gives you a more efficient metabolism, which is going to mean that you don't have to be fed as much to gain the same amount of weight. It's going to mean that you might grow a little more quickly. And apparently it might mean that you lay bigger eggs, right? This might be the key to why there's such a host of changes when you breed for fearlessness in chickens. It's a lot like that melatonin in the foxes. Think back to that video you watched where they said that it was the breeding was affecting melatonin levels and that melatonin influences all sorts of stuff. This looks like it's the same idea, that serotonin influences a lot of things. So if you breed for fearless, you get all this other stuff going on. And again, because we're doing it through artificial selection, you can see those differences pretty quickly in both of these cases, right? 6 generations. Now, there were a couple of other terms in the paper and the book that I wanted to make sure you guys were familiar with. One is neoteny. What it means, another term for neoteny is juvenilization. Right? Juvenilization has the word juvenile in it, which kind of gives you a clue. To juvenilize or to neotenize a species means that species is retaining juvenile characteristics into adulthood. Say that again. Neoteny or juvenilization is the retaining of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. So in the fox video, they mentioned that as they bred for tameness, that those foxes would continue to play even into adulthood. Playing is a juvenile characteristic. It's a juvenile behavioral characteristic. Think about our domesticated pets, dogs, cats. Do your dogs and cats continue to play into adulthood? I know mine do. Play is typically more of a juvenile behavior. It's more of a behavior that young animals do. So this would be one demonstration that there is some level of neoteny in our adult dogs and cats. Some other kinds of juvenile characteristics are physical. They're not all behavioral. For example, a couple of common neotenous characteristics are large eyes compared to head size and large head compared to body size. Think about babies, right? Babies have very large heads compared to the size of their bodies. It's one of the reasons that they fall over so easily. They have these big, giant, heavy heads, right? Big head to body size. And also, babies, children, have very large eyes compared to the size of the rest of their head. So if you keep large eye compared to head size, large head compared to body size, we would say that you are now neotenized as a species. I have 2 images up here. The one on the left is drawing a lot of cartoon characters, particularly drawn in anime style, tend to be highly neotenized. They tend to have very big heads compared to body size, right? Absolutely unrealistic size head compared to the body. This young woman would just fall over. Also, they tend to have very large eyes compared to the eye size of an actual adult human being, right? We are giving them these more juvenile characteristics, small nose, big eyes, big heads. We'll talk about why in a second. But notice, it's not just anime. Look at any Disney princess. Absolutely exaggerated, over large eyes, much bigger head to body ratio than you would see in a real person. But it's not just fictional characters that we draw in this way. We also notice that there are a lot of our domesticated animals that are much more neotenized than their wild counterparts. When we compare a number of our domesticated dogs to the wolf, we will see that they are neotenized. We already mentioned that a lot of domestic dogs still like to play even when they're adults. So that would be a behavioral neoteny. But also, here we have, do you guys know what this breed is? This one's a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. And Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, like many other breeds of dog, they're not the only one, but they have very large heads compared to their body size. They have these big round heads. They also have very big, soft, round eyes. Very juvenile characteristics. Big nose, big eyes, floppy ears. Floppy ears is another neotenized characteristic for dogs. I don't know if you've noticed, but wolves have ears that stand up. They're called prick-eared. It's just the term for it. But some of our domesticated dogs have these flopped over ears, like our King Charles Spaniel does. Now, why? Why do we draw our cartoon characters like this? Why do we breed some of our domesticated animals for this? Well, it's probably because neoteny, we read it, our brains are wired to read neotenized characteristics, juvenile characteristics, as cute, as very, very appealing. It's perhaps because these traits suggest youth, and we're very wired to respond positively to youth, particularly really young individuals. Babies have these characteristics, right? That's the definition of them, is babies have these extreme characteristics and they need care. If these characteristics bring out our caring sides, if they cause us to be more attentive to our babies, for example, then we'll be more reproductively successful and we'll pass these characteristics on. We are as humans, we are very hardwired to respond strongly to these characteristics, to find them cute, to want to give them care, to give care to those who have these characteristics, to find them super appealing. This makes sense, right? I would not exist today to record this lecture if every single ancestor that came before me didn't feel a strong desire to give intense levels of care to a baby, right? Babies cannot survive on their own. They are super helpless for years and years. So the idea that maybe all my ancestors are pretty darn hardwired to want to give care to these little helpless things with big giant heads and big eyes and little small button noses and little tiny feets. Yeah, it's what got me here today. And if I had had an ancestor that's like, meh, it's not so great. Meh, it seems like a lot of work. Well, I wouldn't be here, right? We would have died out. So all of us who exist right now had many, 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 many ancestors before us who all responded very strongly to these juvenile-like characteristics. And what might happen is we're so hardwired for it that we're going to look for it, or we're going to try and create it, or we're going to try and enhance these characteristics, right? One way to enhance them is when we draw pictures of anime cartoon characters, maybe we're going to draw these exaggerated characteristics that are extra neotenized, and we might find them extra cute, extra appealing. When it comes to our domesticated pets, we might be breeding them to bring out even more of these juvenile type characteristics. And we do see that to some degree. We do breed for extreme neoteny in some pets. The picture on the left here is a Munchkin cat. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of these. So what happened is we had some cats that were born with a genetic deformity that prevented their legs from developing correctly and fully. And people thought they were cute. Why? Because they have short little stubby legs. What else has short little stubby legs? Babies. So again, it's a neotenized characteristic that some people liked so much that they started breeding cats with this genetic deformity together to create a line of Munchkin cats. On the right, this one actually is a baby. It's a baby bulldog. We breed bulldogs to have huge head to body ratios. And we do it to this degree only because we think it's cute. This is not useful. Bulldogs were bred for a purpose in the past. Their bodies didn't look like this. Their heads didn't look like this. They didn't have these big old round butts and these little tiny short stubby legs to this extreme. They didn't have such flat faces. A flatter face is, again, a neotenized characteristic in canids. Their noses get longer as they get older. When they're born in pups, they're a little shorter and stubbier. We have bred Munchkin cats to such an extreme that they will have health problems because their legs are so short. It can cause them back problems, in fact. And they're not the only ones. Our bulldogs, our French bulldogs, our American bulldogs, we have bred them to have such big heads that their moms can't actually give birth vaginally anymore. Female bulldogs have to have C-sections because those pups' heads are too big to fit through her pelvic opening. We are so attracted to these baby-like characteristics in animals, these juvenile-like characteristics, that we've bred for extreme neoteny in some pets. Now, not all dogs and cats and domesticated animals have that level of neoteny, but they all have some in comparison to their wild ancestors. Part of that is probably not just because we think it's cute, but we don't need or want adult behaviors in domesticated animals, right? Remember, in that video we were watching, they pointed out that the ancestor to the dog had very large jaws, also had a bigger bulk so that it could take down and tear apart large prey. Also, since domestic dogs were cooperative hunters, they needed to have a bigger brain to problem solve while they were working together on a hunt. So, big jaw, big bulk, big brain to solve problems. Our domesticated dog doesn't need those things. So there's no longer, and through artificial selection, there's not really an evolutionary advantage to dogs having them. In fact, you might want a herding dog, for example. If you're going to have it work livestock with you, you might want a herding dog that actually is a bit smaller, because if it did misbehave and try to bite one of your sheep, it would be less likely to kill your livestock. Or if it misbehaved and snapped at your kid, it's less likely to take off their hand, right? You don't need it to have this huge jaw. It becomes a little bit dangerous. Also, if you have a bit smaller dog than its ancestor, it won't require as much food to keep it fed. You may not think about that as much right now, but when you think back to when dogs and humans first started spending time together, and for thousands of years that they were involved with each other, food was a luxury, right? If you could get away with having a dog and feeding it a little less food, that might mean a little more food for your family. So if you could still get what you needed out of the dog, but it didn't pose as much of a risk to your kids because its jaw is smaller. If it didn't need as much food because its whole body is smaller. Well, once you shrink the body, brain size is going to go along. Also, a little dumber. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I have two dogs. One of them is clearly, to me, much smarter than the other one. Neither are dumb. They're working breeds. They're both gun dog, hunting dog breeds. And those have to be able to do some level of problem solving. And they're bigger dogs, so they don't have super tiny brains. But one, to me, is clearly much smarter than the other, which makes sense given what their breeds are. But those dumb dogs, man, they're really sweet. They don't get into as much trouble in some ways. So you might even find having a slightly dumber dog to be an advantage over a super smart one. A lot of those adult behaviors that we see in wild animals, we really don't need, and we might not even want at all in our domesticated counterparts. So it's not just about breeding them and trying to neotenize them because we think it's cute. It also can be useful. And then finally, remember, many traits are linked. So just because we're getting some juvenile characteristics, it doesn't mean we're choosing every single one of them. In our fox study, we found that Belayev was breeding for tameness. And by breeding for tameness, he got some of those juvenile physical characteristics, like floppy ears. He didn't want floppy ears or need floppy ears. In fact, they were kind of a problem in his study. But because there's some genetic links there between melatonin and coloring and coat pattern and texture and behavior, tameness, you'll get some of those juvenile characteristics just along for the ride. So some of the juvenilization we see, it might not be something we wanted for any particular reason. It just came along with wanting a more tame animal. Okay, think about whether you've got questions or comments or stuff you want to discuss from that Taming the Wild article. and also from the domestication of the dog video. We'll definitely be talking through Belaev's research, as well as a little background on what things were like for Belaev as a scientist and a geneticist working in Mother Russia in the 1900s.